Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. Professor Tomas, right? I'm not going to try saying his last name because it doesn't even look like it sounds, but he'll tell you when he starts. He teaches over at Union. He teaches, what I got, econometrics. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
No? Econometrics, macroeconomics, international finance, economic development. He's currently doing research on financial literacy and the design of retirement plans, and we get our speakers through a lot of different ways. He played Professor Flintlock. Was that his name? We had a Harry Potter party. Flitwick, I'm sorry. He played Professor Flitwick back here, and he had all the kids enthralled with his Professor of Dark Arts talk. So he's going to tell us about this new book. It's the follow-up to Freakonomics. It was a big bestseller a few years ago. It's called SuperFreakonomics by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner. Sweet.
Hi, well, thank you very much for the introduction.
Right.
I'm very happy to be here. So how many of you have read the book? How many of you have read the SuperFreakonomics book? Some of it, okay. There's one, okay. What about the first Freakonomics book? Let's see. We have 1, 2, some of it there. Okay, Freakonomics, the first one. All right. So this is a sequel to Freakonomics, and Freakonomics came out about 4 years ago, and it was a huge hit. It sold, I think, they say 2 million copies, which is million more than any other non-fiction book before. It was on the New York Times bestseller for like a year or something. It's just phenomenal, and nobody expected that this book would become such a huge hit. And so these authors, they took their time in coming up with a sequel to the book. So both books are similar in terms of the kind of book that they are. They both have a mixture of topics. They sort of touch on lots of different issues. So in the first book, they mostly used articles, academic articles, that one of the authors, Stephen Levitt, who's a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, wrote. So he's a professor, and he wrote different academic papers on a variety of topics. And then his co-author, Stephen Dubner, who's he has a book, but he's mostly a magazine writer. The two of them got together and wrote the first Freakonomics book, mostly about Stephen Levitt's academic papers. And they ranged from, the topics that they touched on ranged from the economics of gangs to sumo wrestling to the link between abortion and crime to teaching public school teachers. So they had this collection of papers that Stephen Levitt wrote, and then they put it together, and they've made it into a book, and hence the title Freakonomics, because it's a mishmash of lots of different topics. Okay. And so it became a huge hit, and lots of there's lots of discussion of why it became such a huge hit. Nonetheless, and we can sort of talk about that a little bit, especially those of you who read the first book, why you think it became so popular. But the second book is similar, and it again has a mixture of topics. And the topics here range from prostitution to quality of emergency room care, all the way to global warming. So again, just topics that seem completely disjointed and so unconnected, and hence the title, Super Freakonomics. So I actually have to give you a sense of what Super Freakonomics, what kinds of topics they touch on in Super Freakonomics. I did a little quiz, and it's actually adapted from a website that's linked, from the. I don't have. I think for everyone, I just have a couple. Where you can. There are different questions that. And then you can sort of try to guess what the right answer is to these different questions. But you can see they range from improving lives of women in rural India to hygiene of doctors in the 19th century. So you can take this quiz at home. And see, and if you are interested in the right answers, then you want to probably read the book. Now, of course, after they've written a huge bestseller in this second book, they now have a lot more authority, I think, and people want to listen to them. And so in this book, in the introduction, they talk about what the theme of their books is. Okay, so now they say, look, now we can actually tell you that we think that our first book was not a mishmash, that it actually had a theme. Right? Apparently, they say that the publisher didn't want them to say that they had a theme because it just looked so disjointed. It was just so all these topics were so unrelated together that they, in the first book, said, look, don't try to look for a theme. We just think these are interesting observations, these are interesting papers, and we want to put them together, and you take it or leave it. Right? But there's no unifying theme. Right? So now they're saying that there is a unifying theme. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit before we get into some discussion. And what they say the unifying theme is that people respond to incentives. That's what they say is the unifying theme of the first book, of the first Freakonomics book, and the second book too. And then they say, well, yes, people respond to incentives, but the incentives are not always obvious. Right? And so their contribution is that, look, we can uncover these incentives, and we can show evidence that this is how people behave by looking at data. And I agree. I think that's this is sort of a reasonable description of the theme of the first book. For example, those of you who read the first book, they show that real estate agents, when they sell their own house, they're able to get a higher price than when they sell your house. Right? And they say, well, that's because when they sell their own house, they get 100% of whatever extra money they are able to get for that house. Whereas when they sell your house, they only get 3 cents out of every dollar that they are able to get in price. And so they say, well, that 3%, that's the 3% commission that the real estate agent gets when he or she sells your house. That's not incentive strong enough to sort of make them work really, really hard and get a higher price. So that's an example of, well, look, yeah, that's people respond to incentives, and they actually put together some data to show that that's really how it works. And so, and then there are lots of other examples when they talk about sumo wrestlers and how the incentives of sumo wrestlers differ depending on different situations, and incentives of public school teachers and other situations. Now, some of the other things that they do in the first book, they don't seem to fit that theme that people respond to incentives. For example, the key, I actually I'm going to talk a lot about the first book, partly because I didn't want to spoil the second book, and that's actually good because there are more people who read the first book than people who read the second book. So I don't want to spoil the second book, but I'll talk a little bit about the first book. One of the key things in the first book, one of the most interesting findings, and this comes from a paper that really made Stephen Levitt, the economist, famous, is the link between abortion legalization and crime. Right? So, and this link is prominently featured in the first Freakonomics book. Essentially, what he says is that the story that they tell is that abortion was legalized in 1973, and then 18 to 25 years later, we see a huge drop in crime, and they say, well, that's related. They argue that when mothers can time their childbearing appropriately, when they don't have to, when they have the option to abort pregnancies, then there are fewer unwanted children, and then those children will not be born when abortion becomes legalized, and so 18 to 25 years later, after abortion was legalized, we see a drop in crime, mostly because the children that would have otherwise been born if abortion were illegal would have been in their sort of prime years to commit a variety of crimes. And so this is, of course, hugely controversial, hugely sensitive topic with all kinds of moral issues. Right? And of course, they're very careful about saying, well, look, we don't want to delve into the morality of abortion. We don't want to. We're not saying whether abortion is good or it's bad. We want to strip that away. We just want to sort of point out that, look, there's potentially this link, and they're certainly very careful in showing that link. So is that a coincidence, for example? Could other factors be responsible for the huge drop in crime that we've seen in the early 1990s? And they do a really good job in the book, actually, sort of showing, well, how do you work with the data like this to convince people that, well, this is a plausible story. This abortion legalization is partially responsible for the drop in crime, and so one thing they do is they look at there were 5 states that legalized abortion before 1973 when it was legalized in the United States as a whole, and they say, well, look, in those 5 states that legalized abortion 3 years before Roe v. Wade, the crime drops 3 years earlier. They also show that, so this suggests that, that perhaps the drop in crime did have something to do with abortion legalization. They look at, well, where did the drop in crime come from? Did the drop in crime come from basically everybody, all age groups committing a lower crime? Or was the drop in crime driven by the drop in a particular age group? And they say, well, if for instance, if the drop in crime was because the economy was doing well, or because we have more police on the street, or because we have stricter sentencing guidelines, then if that were the case for drop in crime, we should see drop in crime happen in all age groups. Right? And we don't see that. We only see drop in crime in 1990s in among kids, or not kids, among young adults, among people who are between age 18 and 25. Right? So we see a drop in crime in that particular group. And that's what really drove the drop in crime in 1990s. And they say, well, that again suggests that this particular group is now different. This particular group doesn't have the children who would have been born if abortion were not legalized. Right? So I don't know how this particular story, that's from their first book, I don't know how that fits the theme of people who respond to incentives, for example. Right? I think there's another theme. Certainly, when I first read Freakonomics, the first book, I didn't think that the theme was people who respond to incentives. I thought the theme of the book was that data is very powerful. Okay? And if you know how to ask interesting questions, you can use data to get interesting answers. That, to me, is I'm not saying it's a better theme. I think it's another theme that sort of runs through these books. Right? The first thing that I took away from the first book was that they are just extremely, especially Stephen Levitt, the economist, he's extremely clever at using data. Okay? He basically takes data that is publicly available. Right? We all know, I mean, it's very easy to get data on the crime rates in different age categories, in different states. It's easy to know when abortion was legalized in different states, how many abortions were performed in different states, and then to link those two things, to link abortion legalization and crime. It's not the statistical analysis involved is not very sophisticated. It's actually very, very easy. I mean, we can. I don't actually need a board here to actually explain what's going on. I don't need a graph, right? So that was the beauty, I think, of the first book, and it's also the beauty of the second book too. That to me, that was sort of what I always took away from the first book, and I take away from this second book. That there's a lots of data out there that can be explored, that can be used in a very clever way. That's one of the reasons why I recommended the book to my students. Is that look, now you don't need to know high-level math. You don't need to know differential equation to do this paper that Stephen Levitt did on abortion and crime, and lots of others. Okay, this is just one example of a clever use of data. You don't need to know really sophisticated econometrics, sophisticated statistical methods to do this. You just have to look for data in sometimes unusual places. They look for data on the streets of Chicago by interviewing gangsters in the first book, or interviewing prostitutes in this second book. But lots of other data that is publicly available, and you can use it. And if you can use it in a clever way, you get a really interesting, thought-provoking results. And so I thought that was really the theme of the first book. Okay, data is powerful. You can use data in a clever way. You get interesting, thought-provoking results. The theme for this book, after having read the second book too, I think there's a sort of one more theme that I would like to add that I think really pertains to the second book more than the first book. And that is, things are not always as they seem. In this book, they go into sort of great lengths dispelling conventional wisdoms. They take sort of the conventional wisdom of drunk driving. And they say, well, yes, drunk driving is dangerous, but drunk walking is even more dangerous. And it's true. And they sort of show it using statistical data. They sort of look at what really contributes to global warming. They sort of take on global warming in this book. And they say, well, the conventional wisdom is that in order to stop global warming, we need to cut carbon emissions. And they say, well, not really. There are other ways. And I won't tell you what they are. Because in this book, more than in the first book, they really try to sort of have you sort of take a step back and say, wow, I thought this was true, and it's actually not really true. And so that's another theme of the book. So we have sort of three themes, right? People respond to incentives, data is very powerful, and things are not always as they seem. That's how I would sort of summarize, what these books, these two books are about. Now, I think that I don't have I try to think hard, sort of, if there are any criticisms that I would levy on this book, and so certainly, there are sort of details that one could pick on, and of course, they're both of them are really smart people, much smarter than I am. Very productive, very very articulate in the way they lay out the arguments. Let me give you one example, sort of the kinds of things that I like, and the kinds of things that I didn't like, that have to do with how we look at data. Right? So one thing that I really liked about the first book and even this book is that they go through explain using the data very carefully. They go very carefully about it, right? So they don't just tell you, oh, there's a correlation between legalization of abortion and crime, right? They actually go through great lengths to sort of convince you that that's the way it works. So they say, look, some states did it earlier than others, right? If that's the truth, that's the case, then we should see this prediction. And they tell you, well, that's in the data. They say, well, if our story is true, then the crime rate should drop among this age group and not that age group. And then they tell you, oh, that is indeed true. So they sort of show, they look at it from lots of different angles, right? In addition, they say, well, if the alternative explanation, like more police, is the case, or or something else, then we should see this pattern in the data, and we don't see that. So they're very, very careful in that example. And I sort of described how they go about that, and sort of showing that really, no matter how you slice the data is really consistent with our story. And so they're very critical in the way they address their own story. They try really hard to actually kill their own story, but they can't with the data. And there are some pieces in the new book that I thought they were not as careful. And I'll just take the example of the drunk walking versus drunk driving. They basically look at the number of fatalities per miles driven drunk, right? And they say, well, that number of fatalities is 8 times lower than the number of fatalities per miles walked drunk, right? And usually in these cases, and they're certainly smart enough to know this and just to note this, you would want to look, well, is there something different maybe about the people who walk drunk versus people who drive drunk, right? Maybe people who walk drunk have some other risk factors that contribute to them being them getting killed while walking. Another example is that from this book, they look at how introduction of cable TV in rural India improved attitude of women towards childbearing, towards wife beating. Essentially, they say, well, look, women who had cable TV in villages where they had cable TV, they were less likely to think that wife beating is acceptable, or that, and they were less likely to have lots of children. And so they say, well, look, that's probably that's evidence that maybe cable TV changed these attitudes, and that's certainly a possibility. And I actually went back to the paper that was written not by this wasn't written by Stephen Levitt, by some other really smart economist, and in that paper they actually sort of explain in more detail why there's a causal link between the cable TV and women's attitude, and it's a little complicated explanation, and they sort of omitted that here, right? And so if you think about it, well, is it could it be that perhaps the villages that had the cable TV, maybe those attitudes were different there in the first place, right? So it was not that cable TV changed those attitudes. It was that those attitudes changed, and those attitudes brought on cable TV, right? And so they certainly know enough to worry about this criticism, and they certainly know enough to actually give you the reference here. Well, this is taken from this paper, and if you're interested, you can go and read the paper and actually see the details where the causality comes from. So they have both. They have sort of these interesting facts where they leave out some of the details, and then they have some interesting facts where they have lots of details, where they are really careful And those are the parts that I especially appreciate. I have some questions for you, and that maybe have to do with another potential criticism that is sometimes levied at the Freakonomics movement, and it is whether the topics that they choose are too trivial, too unimportant, too random. And I'm sort of interested, in sort of your views, especially if you read the first Freakonomics book. Do you think that's do you think we should worry about things like climate change is a good one. Yeah, climate change is that's an important one that they take on here. But what about sumo wrestling? From the first book, whether sumo wrestlers cheat, or the economics of prostitution, from this book, from the second book. It's interesting. It's fun. Yeah, it is a lot of fun to read it, right? But I mean, I heard people say, well, bright minds, they should be worried about other things than as to, what day is the most profitable for a Chicago prostitute, and why, and okay, it's interesting, but do we want to spend, resources actually studying that?
Well, the book itself answers the question. Sure it is, because they wouldn't have sold 2 million copies. I mean, why would people care if Tiger Woods had 9 girlfriends, but the Post does 15 pages because the public is interested in such a thing. So, and the second book will be a bestseller too. There's no doubt in my mind. And from my perspective, when you're talking about when it goes against conventional wisdom, that's very interesting. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know that people walking is more dangerous than driving a car. I think they had something about a plane. You're safer if in a car than in a plane, which to me goes against my convention. That's a reason for me to read the book, because I don't believe it. So. They're very smart, and people are interested in that stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
That reminds me, another possible theme, overarching theme of this book is economists have a certain mindset. They look at problems and issues in the world because of their training differently from lawyers who, by their training, look at the world a certain way. So when you mention prostitutes in Chicago, this is how a trained economist might look at this issue because of the training of economists. I wanted to, can I get into the abortion thing? Sure. Granted, assumption, yes, the cohort of people who commit crimes are, let's say, 18 to 25, yes. The birth rate fell when they said it did, but there's so many other possible explanations than abortion. For the real important thing is there are fewer young people to commit crime, so it's the birth rate. That's the important thing. So what causes the birth rate to fall? And it may not be abortion. It could be income levels. We know there's a connection between higher income and lower birth rates. Now, and there are other possible explanations there. Do they go into that in their article to say, well, we know it's not that, it's got to be abortion and not something else?
Yeah, it's you're right. So there are sort of two factors that drive the drop in crime in that particular age group. So one is the size of the cohort, right? If the number of 18 to 25-year-olds is smaller, And if 18 and 25 years olds account for a lot of the crime, then we'll have less crime.
And if there's
But
fewer of them,
there's fewer of them.
fall in the birth rate. But what causes the fall in the birth rate?
But
Why
there's
abortion and not some other explanation for the fall in the birth
That's
rate?
true. The size of the cohort is smaller, but also the crime rate in that cohort is smaller. So they find that the cohort is smaller,
Right.
but the percentage of people who commit crime in that cohort is smaller. So the cohort is, you could say, better. You know, it commits less crime. It is smaller, but also in percentage terms, it commits less crime because it's 18 and 25-year-olds in families that are less at risk of having children that commit crimes, such as single mothers, low-income
Could
mothers.
those families have something else going on besides not having unwanted children? Could they have a higher standard of living? Could they have higher education levels? Could they have, there just seems to me there's an awful lot of perhaps better explanations of what's going on than the connection with abortion. Okay, that just, I've said all I'm going to say.
It's, you're right. And actually, a lot of people, took their data and sort of tried to, massage it, in slightly different ways. And there's another paper that was published, since their paper came out that said, well, the results that they report are not as strong as they show them, but still there's some at least suggestive evidence that there is a link, and the magnitudes. I think they say that since 1973, so immediately following the abortion legalization, there were 1.7 million abortions a year. Right? So it seems like the magnitude is so strong enough. Right? The number of abortions is high enough that it might have, sort of impact. Which I wouldn't have expected. I would have never even thought to look there. Right?
Right.
I mean, who would it's yeah.
The other thing about legalization of abortion, women lived. Now, whether abortion went up markedly or not is a little bit nebulous because the records aren't there. And if you don't have the data, you can't manipulate it. But after it was legalized, the women lived. That we know. Children who are raised in families, children maybe who have mothers, maybe less likely. There are other things to look at. What I want to know is who caused the large sale of these books?
Who caused it?
Yes.
I am.
Who? What age?
What age?
What age? Because there are ages in life where this would appeal, this sort of what we know to be true really isn't true,
Yeah.
would appeal. That would be interesting data too.
I don't. I don't know why it was such success. And in fact, before I leave, I have it's not actually, how long do we take? We have okay. So towards the end, what I wanted to do is I have a couple. I have one more handout where I have a bunch of other books, and there's one here that I call the real first Freakonomics book, and that's Stephen Landsberg's The Armchair Economist. Has anyone heard of that? So that book was published maybe 1995. It's a popular book, but nowhere near the Freakonomics. But it sort of uses the same things. Maybe not to the same extent as Freakonomics, but it's again an economist, so talking about everyday things in life from an economist's perspective. Again, very nicely written, very good book. And it didn't become a huge bestseller. See, there's a... I think probably Joe could speak about this better, but I think in book sales, there's the distribution of book sales is extremely skewed. You have, vast majority of books sell, a couple thousand copies, or a couple tens of thousands of copies, and then there are a few books that sell lots of copies. I think maybe like top 10 books account for 80% of all book sales, or something like that. I don't know the exact statistic, but it's extremely skewed because, the way we read books, right? We sort of hear, well, one person likes it, and then let me read it, and then it sort of cascades, right? So one book is maybe marginally better, right? Just not that much better, but just marginally better, but sort of choose, and then it cascades into.
Your tail is with the subject of global warming. Could you tell us what the authors say is the cause of global warming?
Oh, no. They don't deny global warming, and they don't deny, they don't deny the cause, actually. No, they don't deny the cause. Actually, the cause is, they still say, well, the cause is lots of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Where they depart from the conventional wisdom is how do we mitigate the effects of global warming? And the conventional wisdom is to, we got to cut down on emissions. We got to stop driving, stop running our air conditioners. We need to use solar and renewable. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the conventional wisdom of how to stop global warming. And they have some other ideas. And it's really, and this is that particular part has nothing to do with economics. And they talk to some scientists who have these unconventional ideas, and it's pretty convincing. But again, that's sort of a part of the book where they really focus on telling you things that you thought were true, or sort of dispelling of conventional wisdom here. That's sort of they sort of relish in that. Wow, I want to tell you something that's different. I want to sort of awe you with that. Yeah, you go ahead.
I know you said the data is powerful, and I think most economists agree that how you look at it, you get some different results. But one of the many times missing point is the quantity of the data and the quality of the data. Especially if you have surveys conducted, many times you conduct the survey asking to drunkards or some other groups.
Yeah.
The honesty of their answers is a big difference in which how accurate the answer, not only because they do give wrong answers sometimes, but sometimes they don't know, they just answer it. So how do you take into the account of that in the economic analysis?
You have to be very careful, and it's an excellent question that you have, okay? And because they actually have an example of that. And I don't want to give this away, but they review part of research on economics of altruism. Whether or not people are altruistic, whether people are willing to share their wealth with others. And there's been a lot of research done on that, but a lot of that was done in a lab, where some professor brought in some college kids and then run experiments with them. Like say, well, if I have I'll give you $10, and then you decide how much you're going to share with your partner, and the partner has a right to either take it or leave it, or the partner can reject the offer, in which case none of you get anything, and a variety of experiments like that. And essentially what people found was that people are altruistic. They're altruistic in a lab. But then they talk about another really, really smart researcher. John List is the character in that part of the book. That says, not so. Okay, and so that's an example of where someone, who was again very smart, who looked at this result, this conventional wisdom. Okay, that was in lots of economic journals that say, look, people are altruistic. These are this is how it works, and then he said, well, yes, they're altruistic in a lab, but let me try to take it, into the real world. And he had some very clever ideas, so he had clever ideas by conducting what they call field experiments, where he would not really ask people, well, what do you think, or ask surveys, but rather basically run an experiment on people without people knowing that he's running an experiment. So he went to baseball card trade shows and actually see how the baseball card dealers behave, depending on the particular situation. So again, field experiments is sort of the new cool thing in economics. Okay. Maybe I'd say 10 years ago, it was lab experiments. Experimental economics became sort of, wow, this is, we can sort of try to simulate the environment and see how people behave. And it's very easy because you just get people in a room, you get some undergraduates, come and into the classroom and then run experiments on them. That was sort of regarded as a very sort of the frontier of economic research, 10 years ago. But now, really, thanks to this character John List and Stephen Levitt, he's got paper with John List together. They say, well, no, the lab, the world is different than the lab. So if we want to run experiments, we need to run experiments in a field. Okay, so field experiment would be, if I want to know how people respond to different, in sort of their health consumption and how they respond to different co-pays, then I would have to actually go to a company, right? Take the library, right? And if the library, you're probably town employees, right? Town employees. So I go to the town of Colonie, right? And then I will convince Paula Mahan to let me run a field experiment where I offer, a randomly chosen group of employees this kind of health plan, right? With this copay, and another randomly chosen group of employees, bigger copay, right? And then I see what happens. Do they consume more healthcare with a lower copay than a higher copay? Right? And that's a field experiment. That's not that easy to do. Right? But so you have to be you have to have very willing people in the field, non-economists, non-academic economists, to be willing to cooperate. But it's been done. Yeah.
I think that copay is a big thing. That's why I think Medicare and other reimbursement agencies make it either illegal to not take the copay, like a doctor accepting patients without copay paid, or the pharmacy taking prescriptions filled without giving a zero copay. It results in skewed results and how the people behave. So,
yeah, because if you just look at the data without running the experiment, right, and you look at, people with high copay consume less healthcare. Well, it's because I feel healthy. I'm going to choose a plan that has high copay, right? If I'm sick, I'm going to choose a plan that has a low copay because I expect that I'm going to utilize healthcare more. So if you just look at the raw data as it is, you can sort of infer anything from that as to what is the effect of copays on healthcare consumption or healthcare utilization. Right? You actually need to somehow introduce some random variation. Right? I'm going to impose. You have a high copay, you have a low copay, and then observe what's happening.
Is that area generally referred to as behavioral economics, field studies?
This particular example, not really. When they talk about behavioral economics, they actually, behavioral economists worry that people are not perfectly rational. Okay. So the example with copay, right? That's consistent with perfect rationality, right? You sort of try to you respond to an incentive. Behavioral economists argue that we're not perfectly rational, that we suffer from all kinds of biases. For example, we like to use rules of thumb for things. We don't say compute exactly what is the effect. We just say, well, my colleague has this plan, so I'm just going to go with that plan. I'm not going to. So the impact of, say, peers on what retirement plan you choose, or what healthcare plan you choose, or you behavioral economists understand that people try to sometimes extrapolate the past, into the future, where it may not be the rational things to do. So people, when they see the stock market going up, and they go and they buy stocks. Right? And when they see the stock market going down, they go and sell stocks, at exactly the wrong points in time. And so that's what behavioral economists do. What they do is they recognize that we can't perfectly calculate things. So that's what differentiates them from regular economists. And that's also a very hot area. Yes. And so while we are on this, I'll probably just pass this around because I think it seems since it comes up.
I'll make a copy for people.
Okay.
Give me the last one.
All right. Yes. So there's another one on that list that says Freakonomics for Policymakers. It's a book called The Nudge. Anyone has heard that? The Nudge. Apparently, Obama's people really like it. I sort of underneath each of these books I wrote this is sort of Freakonomics for Policymakers because it's about how to design public policy so that it nudges people in the right direction. And so they specifically recognize, they're behavioral economists, the author of The Nudge, Richard Thaler. He's sort of the guru of behavioral economics. And he says, look, we're humans. We're not econs. And those are sort of the words from their book. And they say we need to, we're imperfect, and we need to design public policies so that it doesn't prohibit us from, say, eating French fries, right? So they're liberal in that sense. They don't want to forbid French fries, even though French fries are bad for us. But they sort of disagree with the notion of, well, look, we're free to choose, and we should have a freedom to smoke cigarettes if we want to, and drink sugary sodas, and eat French fries if we want to, right? But he says, well, as public policy, right? We could design things so that it nudges people in the right direction. So for example, instead of having the French fries in the cafeteria at the eye level, you should put the veggies at the eye level and the French fries, maybe down there, right? That doesn't, because you have to design the cafeteria lineup somehow, right? And you say, well, why not design it in a way that nudges people into the direction of what we think is really good for them, what sort of brings up the rational, long-term self, as opposed to the short-term, irrational, I'd like some French fries, self, right? So, on the list of those books, Nudge, especially Nudge is really great, and especially if you believe the criticism of look, SuperFreakonomics, yeah, it's got some interesting facts, but they're not really that relevant. They're interesting, they're engaging, they're thought-provoking, but I want to know how to make the world better. Okay, then Nudge is for you. Okay.
Is there any movement afoot in any university and anywhere to require a course in these kinds of books?
To
get a major in economics, for example, you have to take a course with these books.
Well,
is there any university out there that's coming up with that idea, or at least electives?
Well, see, so I think the question you ask, have these books influenced what, say, I teach, what researchers do? The answer is absolutely. Yeah, there's no question that this had a big impact on Freakonomics. The first one had a big impact on the kinds of research that economists now do. The profession was really moving in the direction of getting really much more very mathematical, very technical, lots of formulas, lots of complicated math. Okay, Freakonomics just changed the direction, and now, if someone writes a paper on like a third moment estimation with 3 differential equations, that's still, people still do that. But what is really exciting now is findings of these clever uses of data. And we have lots of data. So another book that's on that list is Super Crunchers. Okay, Super Crunchers, it's about using data that has now become really, really plentiful to make better decisions, not just in our personal lives, but for companies, for businesses, for the government, because right now, every time you click on the internet, right, it goes, it's recorded on some hard drive. Every time you make a phone call, right, that data is somewhere, right, and the data, they even know exactly where you are. Right? So the amount of data, because now we live in an electronic world, right? You don't have to, number crunch it. No one sort of records it, by hand. It's all on somebody else's hard drive. So the amount of data that we have is just amazing, and now we can use that data to to learn how the world works, and also to make better decisions, and that's what Super Crunchers is for. So if you like data, Super Crunchers is for you. Right? So what I have there on that list, it's just those are books that they're not knockoffs. They're just sort of in the same category as Freakonomics. They're in the same category that they sort of touch on economics. They're very clever. They're very readable. You don't need economics training to read them. And it's just very fascinating. So any of these, on that list are really good. And I just try to characterize them with just one sentence underneath. I'm sure they have them all in the library.
I'll order for our library.
Wow. Thank you very much.